This is a legacy episode of the Lesbian Historic Motif podcast, originally released as part of the Lesbian Talk Show podcast group. Some references may be obsolete. The show looks at lesbian-relevant themes in history and literature, has interviews and discussions about current historical fiction with queer female characters, including fantastic versions of the past, and presents new original historical fiction for your enjoyment. Lillian Fodderman's book, Surpassing the Love of Men, was one of two books I encountered in the 1980s that convinced me that there were treasures to be found in the history of women's same-sex love. The other one, of course, was Emma Donohue's Passions Between Women. In the introduction to her extensive study of romantic friendship, Fodderman notes that it began as a study of Emily Dickinson's love poems and letters to Sue Gilbert, the woman who became her sister-in-law. Fodderman may be exaggerating her reaction for the sake of a good academic sleuthing story when she says the following. Although Dickinson had written the most passionate and sensual pronouncement of love to Sue Gilbert in the 1850s, there was never any suggestion that she felt the need to be covert about her emotions. If I had really uncovered a lesbian relationship, why could I not find any evidence of the guilt and anxiety, the need to keep secrets from family and friends that I thought were inevitably associated with homosexuality before the days of gay liberation? Furthermore, she questions why Dickinson's editors and publishers, including individuals associated with her immediate family, took such pains to deny or excuse the romantic and erotic content of her poetry and letters, given that Dickinson herself had not seen any reason to conceal them. Now, I have issues with some of Fodderman's assumptions and premises, not only in this starting position as she describes it, but in her projections of the emotional and erotic lives of 19th century women. But the historic analysis inspired by her questions about Emily Dickinson remains of immense value, and her conclusions illustrate a pattern that is repeated several times across Western history. She notes that in the 19th century, it was not unusual for a woman to seek in her romantic friendship the center of her life, quite apart from the demands of marriage and family, if not in lieu of them. When women's role in society began to change, however, when what women did needed to be taken more seriously because they were achieving some of the powers that would make them adult persons, society's view of romantic friendship changed. Love between women, relationships which were emotionally in no way different from the romantic friendships of earlier eras, became evil or morbid. It was not simply that men now saw the female sexual drive more realistically. Many of the relationships they condemned had little to do with sexual expression. It was rather that love between women, coupled with their emerging freedom, might conceivably bring about the overthrow of heterosexuality. End quote. Applied to Emily Dickinson, Lillian Fodderman's conclusion was that the content of Emily's writings was consistent with the social norms for women's emotional relationships with other women during her lifetime. That it was not evidence of what we would understand as a lesbian relationship, and that the later literal erasure of the place of Susan Gilbert in her life was due to the societal shift in how women's romantic friendships were treated, and therefore in how those who were handling her legacy wanted to present her life. Once the possibility of women experiencing sexual desire for each other was recognized, due to the writings of the sexologists and the rising field of psychiatry, the serpent had entered the garden, and women's romantic relationships throughout time were retrospectively suspected of expressing deviant sexuality. Not until the rise of gay liberation, says Fodderman, were we free to embrace our own same-sex erotic desire without guilt and shame. But as for the reality of Dickinson's life, Fodderman says, quote, "These romantic friendships were love relationships in every sense except perhaps the genital, since women in centuries other than ours often internalized the view of females as having little sexual passion. Thus, they might kiss, fondle each other, sleep together, utter expressions of overwhelming love and promises of eternal faithfulness, and yet see their passions as nothing more than effusions of the spirit." End quote. Well, if you want to know my issues with that interpretation, read the summary and analysis of Surpassing the Love of Men in the Lesbian Historic Motif Project blog. But this show isn't about me, or about Lillian Fodderman's book, but about Emily Dickinson. And about the recent movie, Wild Nights with Emily, that very decidedly takes a position on Dickinson's sexuality that does not involve, quote, having little sexual passion, unquote. The movie takes its title from the following poem she wrote around 1861. Wild nights, were I with thee, wild nights should be our luxury. Futile the winds to a heart import, done with the compass, done with the chart. Rowing in Eden, the sea, might I but moor tonight in thee. The homoerotic content of Emily Dickinson's work, and by extension her life, has been a subject of debate from the start, with shifting sides depending on whether one viewed the topic as casting aspersions on that life or exploring its richness, and on whether one were a Dickinson fan or detractor. Emily and Susan met in their late teens in Amherst, Massachusetts, where the Dickinsons were prominent among the social and intellectual elite of the town. Both women had literary pursuits throughout their lives, and at the very least were each other's mentors and supporters in that field. They lived in an atmosphere where devoted romantic relationships between women were normalized and valorized. Emily spent a year at Mount Holyoke's Women's College, famous for romantic pairings among both students and faculty. The women's colleges of New England in the mid to late 19th century were so famous for relationships of this sort that the term Wellesley marriage competed with Boston marriage to identify committed female couples. The correspondence that survives between Emily and Susan is full of not only romantic but sensual longing for each other's presence. In 1852, when Susan was away teaching in Baltimore, Emily wrote, "Susie, will you indeed come home next Saturday and be my own again and kiss me? I hope for you so much and feel so eager for you. Feel that I cannot wait. Feel that now I must have you, that the expectation once more to see your face again makes me feel hot and feverish, and my heart beats so fast. My darling, so near I seem to you that I disdain this pen and wait for a warmer language." Posterity has argued from opposite sides that this was purely conventional sentimental language that shouldn't be taken literally, and that such language is unambiguous evidence of physical erotic desire, and most likely a physical relationship between the two women. The year after that letter was written, Susan became engaged to Emily's brother Austin. Once again, this simple fact has been interpreted from opposite poles. The heteronormalists argue that any marriage to a man negates all the potential evidence of same-sex desire. In similar circumstances for other women, it has been argued that any affection expressed from one woman to another was actually a coded secret message intended to be passed on to a related man. From the opposite pole, it is pointed out that women had a limited set of strategies for ensuring proximity and access to each other. If they were not of a social class and living in an era when it was possible to live independent economic lives, then creating a bond via a male relative produced some degree of stability. I'm reminded of how actress Charlotte Cushman arranged for her lover Emma Crow to marry Cushman's nephew to create a similar recognized bond. Susan and Austin's marriage does not appear to have been particularly successful, despite 3 children. Austin entered a long-term relationship with Mabel Loomis Todd, the wife of one of his employees. After Emily's death, there was something of a feud between Todd and the Dickinsons over who would manage the publication of Emily's poetry and curate her legacy. Todd published an edited selection of poems that were within her control in 1880. Martha Dickinson Bianchi, Susan and Austin's daughter, published other editions based on the material within her control. Not until 1955 was a comprehensive collection published, restored to Emily's distinctive formatting and ordered in roughly chronological sequence. This is the background of the story told in Wild Nights with Emily. The mythologizing of Emily Dickinson as an eccentric recluse, scribbling away at poems unknown to the rest of the world until after her death, is challenged as being a deliberate fictional creation of Mabel Todd. The film tackles its topic with wit, creativity, and satire. I invited my friend Tristan L. Bass from the historic movie website Frockflix to join me to give our impressions of the film, along with a few remarks about other cinematic interpretations of Emily Dickinson's life. I am here with Tristan L. Bass of Frockflix. This is our second time recording a movie review together, and they say once is coincidence, twice is tradition, and 3 times is an ancient honorable tradition whose origins are lost in the mists of antiquity. So we're probably going to get there because we were just chatting about how we desperately need for me to watch Gentleman Jack so we could talk about it.
Definitely. We're well on our way. So, and I've been recapping Gentleman Jack on Frockflix.com. So yeah, you gotta watch that one too, so we can talk about it in full. But today
we are here to talk about Wild Nights with Emily, the most recent, I almost don't want to call it a biopic, the most recent movie about Emily Dickinson. And I have to say, I loved this film. I mean, I hooted, I hollered, I didn't quite pee my pants laughing, but it was fabulous. And I will talk about some of the things I liked about it in detail, but so how about you?
I cackled loudly in the theater. I can tell you what exact point that made me laugh the most.
Was it the one about women not getting involved in politics or something like that?
No, it was the musical version of "Because I Could Not Stop for Death,"
yes,
which is my favorite Emily Dickinson poem. Actually, that's tied with "After Great Pain, a Formal Feeling Comes." But to see that, to put to music, was just, I was dying. It was oh my god.
So we can put that in context, you know, for the listeners.
But it was a funny movie. It was unexpected. It was unpredictable, which, you know, for a biopic or any biographical type film is always exciting because, you know, usually you're going, oh, I know about this person, you know, it's going to be this and this and this. And, you know, how are they going to do this and this and this? Or how is the, you know, so this such and such actor going to perform or embody this person or whatever.
And this film was irreverent, it was satirical, it clearly had an agenda, and it was unapologetic about that, which, you know, if I think a movie has an agenda and is trying to slip it in sideways, it's like, I don't know. But this one was like really in your face. It's like, we're going to talk about some things about Emily Dickinson's legend and how it got to be that way, and we have issues.
Very much so. I will say that I was a little less enthusiastic because of the incredibly low production values, the just absolutely shit costumes. I mean, the director did say she was inspired by Drunk History, and in one of the costume designers had done some episodes of Drunk History, and that's the aesthetic. And I'm judgy on that count. That's what I do.
Yeah, that's your shtick.
I built an online publishing empire around judging costumes in historical films, and so that took away from my enjoyment because it was just so atrociously bad. Like, and sometimes comedically so, and sometimes just like, this is ugly. Like, this is just like, oh, this is just so shitty. It's taking me out of the moment. One of the things, I need a little bit more. Like, one of the things that's great about Drunk History is that it's so over the top from start to finish. That, you know, it's full on just a comedy. This movie was, I mean, there were some serious points, obviously, you know, and there some of the poetry, in fact, was very serious and very beautiful and very lyrical. So sometimes I felt like the tone wasn't sure where it wanted to be. It was a little uneven in that spec, and the costuming, costuming and the production values in general lent to that.
I felt that it had, I don't want to say a consistent tone, but a unified tone, because it was trying to combine both the intense emotional beauty and poetry and la la la. I mean, so like the scene in the grave when it's Emily's death scene, and there's using her poem, "I Died for Beauty," and then juxtaposing her, you know, in the grave with a black soldier from the Civil War,
right,
who is doing the part of the poem about "I died for truth," and it all becomes grand and unified, and that, right, you know, it is simultaneously a little ridiculous around the edges and very beautiful and poetic. But then the film does these deliberate, like the breaking of the fourth wall in the scene. There's a scene where the voiceover of Mrs. Mabel Todd is going on about how, well, of course Emily did admire, her male suitors, and there's this episode with her and the elderly judge, and there's a point at the end where Todd has this voiceover about, I forget the line, but anyway, basically it's like, yes, she certainly, had admiration for him, and the actress playing Emily, turns directly to the audience and basically rolls her eyes,
yes,
in a brain-spraining fashion. And there were a couple points like that where it's the breaking the fourth wall, it's the turning to the audience and letting us in on the joke.
Right.
And so you're right that if you're looking for complete consistency of tone, there's this jar there. But I sort of took it as just a very playful, I love this story and I'm going to have fun with it.
That's fair. It's, I think, again, I was probably put off most by the production value.
Yeah, it did have the feel of a MasterCard movie.
Yeah, it was a very... it was a very low budget film.
I've got to cover this budget with my credit cards.
Absolutely. And that's always going to take me out of the moment. I
understand that it was originally a stage production.
Really? Oh, I didn't know that.
I forget where I saw that.
No, I do think they had workshopped it as like I don't know if it was not really one woman, but a small cast stage show. And I got the impression that I was kind of workshopping it to see where it would go. And they weren't sure if it was going to be stage or if they were going to film it. So maybe that some of that comes out of it.
Yeah. So that there may have been from the start this emphasis on the verbal performance,
right,
in the way that a stage show would,
right. And I think that part definitely the text of the film, the screenwriting was pretty damn good. And some of the performances, I think Molly Shannon as Emily Dickinson was great.
And I loved it so much. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Well, I really liked her casting. I think she had that, both because she is a comedic actress. She came from Saturday Night Live. She's done a lot of comedic roles. She was in that, what was the Little Hours about a year ago, just 2017, which is loosely based on the Decameron. It's about a bunch of nuns. It was super hilariously broadly funny. But she has she can do a dry humor and a reserved humor very well, and things like the asides to the audience and
her facial expressions.
Yeah, her facial expressions are amazing. And yet she can do the serious as well. So she's got a lot more range than you'd think, really, just given the name. Like, someone from Saturday Night Live. And that's, especially looking at her resume, the rest of her work is primarily just in straight comedy. So I think that was pretty much genius casting.
Yes, right, because bringing the comedic overlay.
Yeah.
I mean, somebody else could have taken the same lines and not given it that same sense.
Definitely.
And one of the things that I just really loved about this was the comedy of it, because it's the basic premise of the film, and this is for our listeners to synopsize. The basic premise is that we're seeing Emily's life in retrospect through the myth making of Mabel Todd. Now, Mabel Todd was one of Emily's editors, and she was also her brother Austin's mistress. Her brother Austin, who was married to Susan, who is Emily's lover in the movie, and we'll get on to that part of the story. But so there's this constant progression, seeing Todd doing the myth making. She's giving lectures to audiences in connection with the publication of Emily's poems after her death, and deliberately mythologizing Emily's life for various reasons. I got it as portrayed. Some of it felt like jealousy, because Todd had her own poetic aspirations, and some of it felt like this need to control the story, to control the story of the Dickinsons around here, both Emily and Austin, in ways that Todd couldn't control in her own life because she was the mistress.
Well, and that there's a great line that's one of my favorite lines that so Todd is talking to Austen at one point saying, well, maybe I could publish our love letters and make a book out of that. And he says, oh, no, that you shouldn't do that. That's silly. That's too personal, blah, blah, blah. And clearly she's thinking, but I could be an author myself.
Yes.
And he says, oh, yes, dear, you should have some creative outlet too. Oh, why don't you paint crockery? and it points to something that the director mentioned about the unreliable narrator of Mabel Todd, that she too, she's not a simple villain, but she is looking for, she was a savvy woman doing what she thought, this is the director's words, doing what she thought was necessary for the satisfaction of her own need for creative expression, even if the poetry belonged to someone else. And that line about, oh dear, you should just paint crockery.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the truth of the time, is that, women as writers, as authors of their own, not a going concern, not a vital option
and there's
for so many people.
There's an underlay of that in how Emily's work is received. And there's this tension between Mabel Todd mythologizing that, oh, Emily didn't want to be published in her own lifetime and all this. And then you cut over to showing Emily sending her poetry out to publisher after publisher and being told, it's like, you're not quite ready yet, dear.
Right.
Or maybe if you made it rhyme.
Right. Or wrote some of the little trite stuff that was okay for women to write at the time. Like, just write something sweet and simple that rhymes. That's fine. Nothing challenging.
Yeah, and not taking women as artists, as authors, seriously. Exactly. And so you see that from both sides. It makes Mabel much more sympathetic, even as you despise her.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, she's not a one-note character, which it's easy to when you realize that the main crux of the story is that it's based on all this correspondence between Emily and Susan, her sister-in-law, that Mabel Todd literally erased, like, from the paper, like physically erased. Their relationship was physically erased from the record. Like, and it was rediscovered and published by this scholar in the 1989 or 1998. Sorry, I'm bad with numbers. And so, you could think of Mabel Todd as just, oh, this horrible person. Oh, she just erased. Oh, maybe she hates women who had relationships with other women. And no, she was just. Maybe she did, but the real thing is that she was building herself up. She was trying to have a career and a profit and what have you for herself. I mean, she's looking out for number one, because what else could a woman do at the time? It's a sorry statement on the state of affairs for everybody. And patriarchy hurts everybody, queer or not. It just fucks with all women. Sorry.
Yeah, and in this film, there's this tension between how much the film is showing a historic truth and how much it's showing one reading of history, because we don't necessarily know Todd's motivations. There is one strain of thought that says she was sincerely and genuinely trying to protect the reputation of her sister-in-law. That's an interesting aside on it, that one of the books that first got me into seriously researching queer women's history was Lillian Fatterman's Surpassing the Love of Men. And in that book, Fatterman mentions that one of the things that got her into researching it was looking at the life of Emily Dickinson.
Really?
And how in Dickinson's own work and in these letters, there is this effusive, very romantic, definitely erotic sentiments directed towards women. And then by the time her poetry and her letters are being published, there's this contraction, this withdrawing, this suppressing, this erasing of not just the relationship, not just the romantic aspect of the relationship with Susan, but the eroticism itself. Fodderman was trying to make sense of this. It's like, how within the space of one woman's lifetime could you go from being completely open about this to being, so very repressed about it? And I disagree a lot with Fodderman's approach to the topic.
Sure.
But it definitely is one of those turning points. Yeah. And there have been multiple turning points like that in history, where we went from a society where women were, where it was normal for women to express sentimental, romantic expressions towards each other in public without being self-conscious about it at all. And then the servant comes into the garden and says, "Love means sex, and sex is evil." And suddenly you're reading Freud, and we know where that went. Yeah. So that's one of the things this movie is trying to redeem, is saying not only was Emily's poetry definitely romantic and erotic, but so was her life. Right. She was not this repressed recluse in a white dress that, she probably had issues.
Yeah.
But that aspect of her life is neither something to be hidden nor something that was unusual or abnormal.
Right. I'll take issue with the white dress too. That is one thing that, for all of this movie's, myth busting, it does go full on with the white dress, and that's, she had a white dress, and it survived, and so that fed into the myth of the Belle of Amherst and the recluse and the woman in white. And it's one white dress that survived from the 1870s to the very end, towards the end of her life. And it was in various museums, and then finally, it's in the museum that's her house since around the 1940s. Lots of women wore white at the time.
Yeah,
it was common. It was fashionable. It wasn't like she wore white and that was like, ooh, she's weird. No, women wore white, and it's not like she only wore white. There are, there were other dresses of hers that survived as well. It's not a thing. So So this movie totally went full hog with that one. Like, come on now, if you're gonna bust myths, let's bust them all.
Yeah. So one of the other things that I liked about this movie was the non-linearity. Yeah. The way that it not only jumped back and forth from, after Emily's death with Todd giving the lectures, and then cutting back to the real story of the content, but just the ways in which it jumped back and forth, and it kept cycling through her life, and yet eventually coming full circle at the end to her death. And the very sweet, sweet is the wrong word for this, the very poignant scene where Susan was asked to wash and lay out her body, which was, a very personal, intimate thing that was usually done by the closest female family member. And then the way that scene gets put up on a split screen with the scene of Mabel Todd literally erasing Susan's name from the correspondence. Right. And so juxtaposing that proof of intimacy. And that's an episode that nobody disputes. That's part of the historic record is that Susan was the one who washed her body after death. And so it just made this wonderful juxtaposition, which of course was very deliberate. But.
No, definitely. And, that's, again, very historically accurate in that moment.
So let's talk about the Yellow Rose of Texas.
Oh, God. I busted out laughing because that was so funny. I mean, I like when a movie about an artist or a poet or tries to bring that art to life. I know it can be so hokey and it's overdone, but I don't care because I like the attempt. And yes, the attempts can be hokey and goofy, and a lot of times it's just you put the text on the screen. This film does that, but the actual trying to act out some metaphors.
Yeah,
I just something about me loves that. It's the theatricality, but it's also it's how your mind works when you read poetry or even when you look at art. You think this is a thing. This is actually something happening there. Metaphors and allegories exist for reasons. They're supposed to create pictures in your head, and to see that attempted on screen is just so interesting. I want to, again, not every attempt succeeds, and some of them were better in this film than others. The Yellow Rose of Texas says, "Because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me." I'm getting that was hilarious and so wrong, but that's what made it right. And also it was done to cover up sounds of it was not intentionally, but it was covering up the sounds of sex in the upstairs. Yes. So that was even more hilariously wrong and bad.
So to set this up for the listeners who may not have seen the movie yet, so the scenario is this: Mabel Todd is trying to get a glimpse of Emily, who is this famous recluse, and she offers to come over and play piano for her. She comes over. The housekeeper says, "Well, there's the piano. Emily's upstairs. She'll be listening."
And Emily really just doesn't want to see her. It's not like she's a recluse. She's fine.
Because Emily, in this film, Emily knows that her brother is fucking Mabel Todd, and she just doesn't want to deal. Yeah. And the housekeeper, lays out the music for Mabel to play, and then slips in sheet music of the Yellow Rose of Texas. And the joke here, which all the Dickinson aficionados know by heart, is that an awful lot of the metrics of Emily Dickinson's poetry have that particular metrical scheme that scans to the Yellow Rose of Texas and a lot of other similar pieces. So you see Mabel Todd sit down to play the piano, and she starts playing the Yellow Rose of Texas, and then you hear this very somber, meaningful poem, "Because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me," except it is to that song.
Yeah.
And you just have to laugh because it's like, oh my God, it's the metaphor instantiated.
Yeah, it's hilarious. Admittedly, the screening I was at, there were some people who they didn't get it. I mean, either they didn't know the poem or they just didn't understand, why is this happening? Which is fine. It was
a movie that rewarded being part of the in-joke.
It actually did. Yeah, it really did. It helped if you knew some of the poetry. You didn't necessarily have to know her life story because, again, this is telling you something that you probably don't know about her life story. Yeah. But it helps if you know some of the poetry. Yeah. Because you will appreciate that more. Like the gardening scene and the poetry there was just so beautiful. That was really beautiful, and you already mentioned the death scene, and that was
and the other amusing one, and it's like gallows humor type of amusing. So Mabel Todd's husband evidently was institutionalized for a mental breakdown, and they introduced this in a throwaway scene, and he is quoting one of Emily's poems, and I forget which one it was. I didn't note that down, but it was something about. That fit with the sight of him being hauled away in a straitjacket, and it was funny and sad and absurd.
Exactly. I was going to say that something I mentioned in my Frogflix review is that those performed poems reminded me a bit of Frida, the film with Salma Hayek, where they recreated some of her paintings came to life. And it's that same kind of weird, good, kind of cool, it's like, because her paintings are very lifelike, and you see them, you see her dressed as a thing coming out of the frame. And that's what, there was this, I don't remember what the poem it is now, of Emily Dickinson's, but that's there's like a river scene.
Oh yeah, that was the very dreamlike episode where the people are waiting in the river, and there was poems. Yeah, and it was just very strange and surreal, but it came at a good moment where you're like, all right, I think we need that here. That was some good editing. That's the spot where you need that. So again, I really appreciate those. I know those are not everyone's cup of tea, but I think that's where some of the tonal shifts sometimes worked, and I think maybe won't work for everybody.
because when it goes from the really funny to the really kind of surreal, and then there are some moments that are a little flat. One moment that I thought was really funny though. The cat. Oh God.
Yeah, so Emily Dickinson's sister Lavinia has a cat, and they are sitting around in the parlor. Lavinia is petting her cat, which is obviously a stuffed toy.
Fake, totally fake cat.
And it's going meow, meow, meow
All
as
time.
she pets it. And Emily, and who's the third? So I don't think it's Susan, but it's
picture. Who is
the aunt,
person?
maybe?
It's
where is it, Susan?
Oh no, it's not. No, it's Susan and her sister and Emily.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, and there's this thing, and Lavinia is depicted as being a bit simple.
Yes.
And the line is the cat comes into it because later again Mabel Todd is still trying to meet Emily.
Yes.
And Austin, their brother, is begging Emily. It's like, why don't you just meet her, say hello. And Lavinia says, well, my cat's named Emily. We could introduce her to the cat.
Yes.
And then she'd say she's met Emily. And it's like, that is just so bizarre.
Exactly. So, it throws in these little bits that, sure, why not?
Yes.
Why not?
And the thing you said about, you don't have to be familiar with Emily Dickinson's life, I think that it would be very incoherent if you didn't know the basic outlines of her life because of the nonlinearity.
I think if you know the myth, that's useful.
Yeah.
The crazy reclusive poet, nothing published during her lifetime. If you know that much,
okay.
I think that helps. The nonlinearity, I can't say that word. We're just gonna let it go. I mean, films do that.
Yeah.
So, you're either going to go with it or you're not.
Yeah.
But I don't, because this is introducing things that most people, I know a lot of Dickinson. Mm-hmm. I didn't know this about her until I started looking at the film. And I heard about the film. I'm like, what? Cool. We know something new about, there's been new research. We know something new about Emily Dickinson. Awesome. I want to see this film now. We're going to go see this. Come on, let's go. So I went with Kendra, one of the other writers on Frog Flicks, and she knew basically that about Emily Dickinson, and she just was like, that was hilarious. Is that real? As far as we know, yeah, apparently that was real.
But I think, as a semi-serious historian, if I may call myself that, I came out of it thinking, it's like, okay, this is good myth busting, but it's not good history. Yeah. Because it does the speculation in the other direction. It's like, we don't know what Emily's internal life was.
Sure.
We don't know whether they fucked or not.
Right.
For me, it doesn't matter.
Right.
Because, I come to this without that early 20th century judgment that says, physicality would ruin the purity of their beautiful romantic friendship.
But to the other point though is we almost never know what they really thought when it comes to most historical figures. It's so rare. I mean, that
Anne Lister is like one of the very rare exceptions.
Precisely. We have letters. And this is, based on some letters, and so we don't know again, romance, sex, what depth of what goes to what, we don't know. We just, unless you are Anne Lister, and even then she wrote it in code, so.
And she wasn't always a reliable narrator, even when she was
not. Well, nobody, yes. If you're writing in your diary, you are not a reliable narrator, because you're writing for yourself.
Yes. Exactly.
So, that's not reliable either. You need, a couple of corroborating sources. So there's always some level of question mark and supposition, and we just have to go with it as much as we can.
Yeah.
I don't mind that. I think it's fair, considering the passion in the letters and the long-term relationship there was, and the proximity. It's not like they lived on opposite sides of the country.
They lived with the girl next door.
Yeah, they were literally next door, and they wrote to each other for 30 some odd years, and with this depth of passion and
it's just undeniable.
To say that they didn't act on it in some physical way
is beside the point.
It's certainly reasonable plot for a movie.
Mm-hmm. Yes,
it's not outside the realm of possibility, and so I'm going to give it to them because you can't say they didn't, you can't say they did. It is what it is. It's reasonable enough to write a movie about.
So I think we're both giving this a definite thumbs up.
Yeah, I think it's definitely worth watching. Again, with the qualifications that it is low budget, costumes suck.
It's definitely art film.
It's an art film. But I think
that's going to be inevitable with a subject like this.
Totally, but it's definitely fun, and it's a new look at a subject probably most people don't know much about. Or we only know one thing about.
Yeah, so we were comparing notes on a previous Emily Dickinson film that we apparently have very different opinions on. So this is A Quiet Passion, and it came out in 2017, or at least that's when I watched it.
That's when it came out.
And I went to see that one on a whim because the traffic was awful, and I decided to see a movie in downtown Berkeley before driving home. And I hated it. It was so dreary. I'm going to read the conclusion of my review on it. The conclusion, prose. Excerpts from Dickinson's poetry are used to good effect in communicating mood and setting. The costuming looks pretty solid. You're going to have other added comments on that. Although there were a few outfits that looked badly fitted in the upper torso. Cynthia Nixon does an excellent job of inhabiting the role of Emily Dickinson as depicted in this script. Cons. The movie makes you wonder why everyone in the 19th century didn't just take to their beds and embrace oblivion in order to get all this dreary business of existence out of the way and move on to salvation. This is the most depressing movie I've seen in a long time, and that includes Lost and Delirious, which is so evil I think no one should ever watch it again. So that was my conclusion, but you have a different take.
A bit more moderate, I'd say. It wasn't like the favorite thing I ever watched in the world, but I believe I started mine with a title like A Quiet Passion and a topic such as Emily Dickinson. Audiences should know that this biopic is not going to be full of action, sex, or even much romance. What drama comes is from seeing how the few yet piercing events of this 19th century recluse's life created an artistic miasma that resulted in her poetry. I had a feeling of that day.
Yeah, you were saying that it sort of touched your goth soul.
It basically. Director-writer Terence Davies uses lighting, angles, and dialogue as precise and cutting as Dickinson's own poetry to create believable moods and influences for an artistic life. And of course he intercuts Cynthia Nixon, who plays Dickinson, speaking the poetry, intercuts with Cynthia Nixon speaking the poetry at appropriate scenes. Mm-hmm. So it's like a poetic artsy thing, and it's slow. Also, this film is not for everyone. If you aren't already a fan, maybe I read your review already. If you aren't already a fan of Emily Dickinson, this may seem too slow and moody, and you might be better off just picking up a book of her poems and seeing if any of them stick.
Yeah.
So
it was very atmospheric. I will get that.
And that was what I was trying to say. It's atmospheric. I loved Cynthia Nixon's performance. I thought she was excellent. I liked how snarky she was. Mm-hmm. She was she had these funny barbs, and she was witty and a little mean at times. And she wasn't the nicey, little shy, withering thing that kind of
the nice Victorian woman.
No, she wasn't. And the costumes were decent. By the way, though, 1840s to 1860s is, as we have often said on Frock Flicks, prime time of the death of fashion. So they're boring, but they did them fine. there was a thing that I think the costume designer, the director said about it was the director said about people were dirty, they smelled, and their lives were anything but prettiness. So in this film, only the father has a stiff collar. All the other characters have floppy ones because they would have sweat through them. And so he wanted kind of a lived-in look, which, fine, whatever. It's, and it happens.
It really, well, so in some ways, A Quiet Passion lived the mythologizing, the preoccupation with mortality.
Yeah.
It really dwelt a lot on the physical hardships of life in the 19th century, and Emily's mother's lingering chronic illness.
It really went into her family life with her mother and her father, very stern, taciturn father. Her bickering, her religious bickering between her family members, which, I mean, that was true. That was important, and I think that's a side of her life that went into her poetry as much, because she's so much of her poetry, the preoccupation with death, which, yes, is why I love her poems. I am a goth. It happens. But that comes out of her religious questioning and battles with the religion she was given from her father, and her struggle with that and her questioning of that, and what does it mean, and what is death, and all of that's going around, and she's working through that in her poetry.
And that's not just her. I mean, the entire tenor of the times. Of course. Victorian preoccupation with mortality and death is legendary. Yeah. So it's not a uniquely Dickinson thing.
No, but the way she expressed it in her poems was her unique way. Because she wasn't doing it, first off, she was a woman doing it, and she was doing it in a unique meter and rhyme and method, and she was questioning. She was
very contemplative, not in a necessarily morbid way, but what does this all mean?
Yeah, and really questioning, really, saying, the prescribed religion isn't. It's there, it means something, but maybe it's not exactly going down that exact way. I mean, she's a lot. I mean, she's by no means, she's not an atheist. She definitely was very much Christian, but she was kind of questioning the dogma.
I saw something in one of her biographies about how one of these traveling revival shows had come through, and she'd tried on, the whole, I am saved Jesus thing, and it didn't stick. And at some point later, maybe it's in one of her poems, it's something about, some people, pray in church, and I pray, in my garden or something like that.
Yeah,
I forget the exact line, but.
Yeah, I mean, she probably would have had more in common with the transcendentalists if she, got out and. Or if they'd come near her. I mean, that was... I can't remember my East Coast geography because, let's see...
Amherst,
Massachusetts, where it was Ralph Waldo, not Emerson.
Well,
anyway.
Emerson actually shows up in Wild Nights with Emily.
Was that Emerson there, or was that
Ralph Waldo Emerson was... He's the mumbler.
Oh, he was the mumbler.
Yes.
I was only thinking of the publisher who
Higginson,
who is played by a guy who shows up in Drunk History all the time. Another period. He shows up in Drunk History, but he's in another period he plays Hamish the gardener.
He was quite a character.
Yeah. And
so Higginson is the publisher who published Mabel Todd's edition of Dickinson's poetry.
And then there's a scene where Dickinson harangues him for there's there's a clock going around, and she's just questioning and saying just everything, and it's amazing. It's this great scene because she has this.
And he basically walks away saying, "That woman exhausts me."
Yes, and it's great. It's it's very much the antithesis to the idea of Dickinson didn't want anything published or didn't have any literary opinions during her life. She just sit there and scribbled and tucked her poems away. No, none of that nonsense.
Yeah, so it the two of them together make an interesting angle. It's not just the myth and the demythologizing, but it's it's the sort of very serious, somber take, and then the deflation, the poking fun, the not taking seriously, and I think together they do make a better whole together than each on their own.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's what I love, is when there are very different biographical films, because when we get certain characters that are made in films it's always the same, Queen Elizabeth or Anne Boleyn. I mean, those are all the same.
They become a mirror for the director's vision, rather than themselves.
And they're not telling, because there are, like, these two films in particular are telling different parts of that same person's story, and they fit together very in an interesting way. Not like perfect, they're not like perfect, but they tell different parts that are perfectly valid parts. One kind of, they each ignore different parts, but they're also telling parts that happened. And that's cool, because you learn different things and you see the director's different take on different things. It's much like reading different biographies when you're actually getting more of the historical side, but even just seeing it on film, seeing a different take.
I was almost tempted to go see if I could dredge up a copy of The Belle of Amherst.
I have tried to watch that because there's a really shitty version, or at least there was, on Amazon, and it was just such a bad...
Because that's like...
It's from the 70s?
I thought it was like earlier than that.
It might be. Maybe that's why. It was such a bad version that I couldn't watch. I just couldn't watch much of it. It was just so
and
bad.
It was, as they say, very much of its time in terms of a movie.
Yeah, I remember the quality was so bad of the stream, because Amazon, when
they're probably streaming an old VCR or something.
Pretty much, it was like that, and I just couldn't try. So
I can easily like imagine what it was like, but I just couldn't. I couldn't take 5. Well, so I did not subject you to that then.
But I think these two, they definitely tell some certainly valid points. One more recent, one more up on the scholarship, certainly.
And each with their own, well, the Wild Nights with Emily is definitely I would say it has an agenda.
Yes.
I don't know that I would say A Quiet Passion had an agenda. It definitely had an opinion. But it does that thing where it purports to be the rational, true version, which is itself an agenda, but not in the same way.
Of course, yeah. I mean, Quiet Passion was trying to be the standard,
the standard biopic, yeah.
And one of those hadn't been done about Emily Dickinson, so it was about time she got at least that due.
Yes,
and for such a seminal figure in American poetry to not have anything except for one. And I think Belle of Amherst was like an hour-long TV movie. So to have a relatively bigger budget and well-known director do the full screen treatment, that was something.
But I would definitely encourage people with any interest in Emily Dickinson, in poetry, in feminism, in the Victorian Romantic Friendship movement, any of those, not people who are interested in really well-researched costume plays, but to definitely see Wild Nights with Emily and go into it ready to laugh.
Yeah, and it's supposed to be on streaming services sometime this summer.
Yeah, it's still making the art house circuit right now, and it did the festival circuit last year, I guess.
Yeah.
But it should be ready for general distribution pretty soon now, and go see it.
Yeah.
I hope you've enjoyed this episode of the Lesbian Historic Motif Podcast. See the show notes for links to people and topics. Most shows will have a transcript linked as well. If you have a book announcement, a topic suggestion, or might like to appear on the show, please drop me an email. If you enjoyed this podcast, please rate it and subscribe on your favorite podcast app, and consider supporting our Patreon. Because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. The carriage held but just ourselves and immortality. We slowly drove, he knew no haste, and I had put away my labour and my leisure too for his civility. We passed the school where children strove at recess in the ring. We passed the fields of gazing grain, we passed the setting sun. Or rather, he passed us, the dews grew quivering and chill. For only gossamer, my gown, my tippet, only tulle. We paused before a house that seemed a swelling of the ground. The roof was scarcely visible, the cornice in the ground. Since then 'tis centuries, and yet feels shorter than the day I first surmised the horses' heads were toward eternity.